A husband stands in front of a sheriff's deputy, pointing toward an empty gravel road. He says his wife got into a white pickup truck with a bald, bearded stranger and drove away. He says she texted him afterward. He says she's fine. He says all of this with tears in his eyes. But here's what he doesn't know yet. Every single piece of that story is about to fall apart. The stranger never existed. The truck was a ghost, and the messages he showed police weren't from his missing wife at all. They were typed by the same hands that were pointing down that empty road. This is the story of Michaela Faye Meave Byers, a woman who spent her whole life trying to protect children who weren't even her own. A woman who was finally getting ready to walk away from a broken marriage. And a man who decided that if he couldn't keep her, no one would. Unreal True Crime launches its new book, Unreal True Crime, Latin edition. 35 shocking true murder cases from across Latin America. Buy it now on Amazon. Michaela Faye Meave Byers was born on June 15, 1993 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to Michael Kevin Downs and Barbara Sue Ezell Harper. She was raised in the small town of Lexington, Oklahoma, where she went through school and eventually graduated with Lexington's Bulldog class of 2011. From the outside, Michaela's childhood looked like a lot of small-town Oklahoma childhoods. But the people who knew her say there was something different about her, even young. She was musical. She loved to sing. Her family remembers her as a vibrant soul, the kind of person whose laugh you could pick out in a crowded room. Later in life, when people who loved her tried to describe what she meant to them, they kept coming back to small sensory things. Her smile, her laugh, and, oddly specifically, sunflowers. Her sister Andrea would later say that, to this day, she can't look at a sunflower without thinking of Michaela. She grew up close to her mother, Barbara, and her older sister, Andrea Meave. That closeness with Andrea would follow her into adulthood. As adults, the two sisters spoke on the phone almost every single morning, like clockwork, right around 7 a.m. It wasn't a chore for either of them. It was just what they did. As Michaela got older, a pattern emerged that would define the rest of her life. She gravitated toward children who needed help, not in an abstract, someday I'll be a mom kind of way, in an active, hands-on way. She began working in schools. She took a job as a teacher's aide, a paraprofessional, with Macomb Public Schools, working directly with young children in the classroom. And she didn't stop there. She enrolled in coursework to become a fully licensed teacher, working toward a degree while she worked full-time, effectively building a second job on top of a first one, all centered on kids who weren't hers by blood. People who knew her professionally described her the same way her family did. When Macomb Public Schools later spoke publicly about her, they called her a beloved educator who cared deeply for her students and their families. The kind of person whose absence would be felt in the building itself, not just in the abstract. At some point in her 20s, Michaela reconnected with a man from her past named Frank Allen Cole Byers. The two had crossed paths earlier in life, and years later they found each other again through Facebook. Frank worked for an environmental cleanup company that dealt with hazardous materials, a job that kept him traveling. Whatever history they'd had before, this reconnection turned romantic, and it moved fast. Frank already had 4 young daughters, and Michaela, who by every account built her entire identity around caring for children, apparently didn't hesitate. She stepped into the role of stepmother to all 4 girls. Around the same time, she and her family had already been building a life of chosen motherhood. She had adopted 2 teenagers out of the foster care system. So by the time she married Frank in June of 2022, Michaela was, in every functional sense, a mother to 6 children, 4 stepdaughters, 2 adopted kids, 0 biological children, all hers by choice. For a while, this looked like exactly the kind of blended family story people root for. Michaela moved onto Frank's property, a roughly 10-acre spread out in Macomb, Oklahoma, a small rural community in Pottawatomie County. She threw herself into raising the girls. Her sister Andrea would later say that helping little innocent kids that needed adult help was the biggest thing in Michaela's life, and that she felt personally responsible for doing it. It's worth sitting with that for a second. This was a woman with no biological children of her own, who had already adopted 2 teenagers out of the foster system, and who then walked straight into raising 4 more girls that weren't hers either. By every account available, she didn't see that as a burden. She saw it as exactly who she was supposed to be. But underneath the surface, the marriage was already cracking. About a year into the marriage, Michaela learned that Frank had been unfaithful. For a woman who had built her whole adult identity around loyalty, protection, and showing up for people, this landed hard. She and Frank separated for a period. According to her sister, Michaela stayed with Andrea for about a week during this time, and she cried every single night. Not because she was weak, because the marriage she had poured herself into was falling apart, and because leaving meant potentially losing daily contact with 4 girls she now considered her own. So Michaela made a choice that would ultimately cost her everything. She didn't fully leave. She moved out of the main house but stayed on the same 10-acre property, into a small shed-like structure Frank had converted into a livable space, physically separated from Frank, emotionally trying to exit the marriage. But geographically, she stayed close, because those 4 little girls were still there, and she wasn't willing to just disappear from their lives. By the summer of 2023, Michaela and Frank were, by every account, heading toward divorce. They lived in separate structures on the same land. Frank had reportedly moved on to seeing other women, including a woman he had met at a gas station. Investigators would later find messages from Frank telling this other woman that he had no intention of getting back together with Michaela. 2 days before her death, Michaela did something that revealed exactly where her head was. She recorded a conversation with Frank. In it, she told him, clearly, directly, that she had never been more determined to divorce him, and that he had officially lost her. Investigators would later believe she recorded that conversation deliberately, to document his infidelity and protect herself going forward. This wasn't a woman drifting passively toward the end of a marriage. This was a woman actively building her exit. Then came September 15, 2023. According to what investigators pieced together afterward, Michaela went to work that day as usual at Macomb Public Schools. That evening, she came back to the property, and the working theory is that she came back specifically to gather her belongings and leave for good. This wasn't an ordinary evening. This was the night she was trying to close the door on the marriage for real. At some point after she arrived home, Michaela walked into the main house, the home she had once shared fully with Frank. Home security footage, recovered much later, would show her going inside and staying for approximately 14 minutes. Investigators believe she and Frank argued during those 14 minutes. Then the footage shows her leaving the main house and heading back toward her own small structure. Sometime in the window right after that, investigators would later estimate around 4 in the afternoon, Michaela Faye Meave Byers was shot, twice in the head. Inside the small home where she had been living, a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to protect children from harm was killed on the same land where she'd been raising 4 of them. What happened next is almost unbearable in its ordinariness. After killing Michaela, Frank left her body inside the small structure and went to pick up the girls from school just like any other day. He brought them home. According to what the children later told investigators, Frank was outside for most of that night. The next morning, September 16, 2023, Frank called the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office and reported Michaela missing. He told Deputy Dustin Richardson a very specific story. Michaela had left the evening before, around 5:30 p.m., getting into a white Chevy extended cab pickup truck with tinted windows. The driver, he said, was a tall, balding white man with a dark beard, somewhere around 6 feet to 6'1" and about 200 pounds. He said he'd last heard from her around 8 that night. He even showed the deputy a Facebook message he claimed Michaela had sent afterward, telling him she was fine and to back off. Deputy Richardson followed Frank to the small structure where Michaela had reportedly been staying. It was locked. Frank claimed he didn't have a key. Almost immediately, something about the scene didn't sit right with Richardson. He left the property and called another deputy to say the situation felt suspicious. That instinct, on day 1, is the moment this case quietly shifted from a missing person report into something else entirely. Law enforcement issued a BOLO alert for a bald, bearded man in a white pickup truck. Nothing came of it. No sightings panned out, no truck, no man. Meanwhile, Michaela's family mobilized immediately. Her mother, Barbara Harper, grew alarmed almost right away, because Michaela was supposed to help at the family restaurant, and missing that without a word was completely unheard of for her. Her sister Andrea tried calling repeatedly. No answer. The daily 7 a.m. phone calls stopped. Over the following days, a massive search effort came together in rural Pottawatomie County. Family, friends, community volunteers, and law enforcement searching on foot, by kayak, and with drones through wooded, muddy, tick-infested terrain. Michaela's mother, Barbara Harper, was out there with everyone else. And at some point during that search, she says she felt, almost heard, the word tin horn, the local, rural term for a drainage culvert. She couldn't explain it. She just felt pulled toward the idea that her daughter was in one. And in the middle of that search, something stood out to investigators, particularly Detective Marcus May. Frank never joined a single search party. The man who had reported his wife missing, who had cried on camera about how hellish this was for him, never once physically looked for her. Detective May would later say Frank seemed far more interested in what investigators knew than in finding Michaela. Frank also went public. On October 2, 2023, he gave an emotional interview describing how constantly he was calling, texting, and messaging, desperate for news. He later told people that he and Michaela had an open marriage, and that she'd simply gone out on a date. Michaela's family rejected that outright. They knew their daughter and sister. And investigators, quietly building their case, already understood something Frank apparently didn't know they knew. It wasn't Michaela who'd been stepping outside the marriage. On day 5 of the search, Michaela's cousin and a friend were walking near a drainage culvert, a rural structure locals call a tin horn, close to Hamilton and Prospect Roads, about 2,000 feet from the property. According to the 911 call made that day, they had been walking near canals close to the water when they noticed the smell. On September 20th, 2023, they found Michaela's body inside that culvert wrapped in carpet. The medical examiner determined that Michaela had been shot twice in the head, along with a graze wound, and ruled her death a homicide. From that point forward, the investigation moved quickly and methodically, and every piece of Frank's original story started to unravel. Investigators found .22 caliber shell casings inside the small home where Michaela had been staying, along with a recently fired .22 rifle. They recovered a bullet embedded in a 2x4 in her bedroom, wrapped in what they believed might have been Michaela's own hair, though they were unable to confirm that genetically. They pulled Frank's work boots, seized the night he'd reported her missing. Investigators noticed a dark substance on them that looked like blood. But because Frank's job routinely exposed him to industrial chemicals, they had to wait for lab confirmation. 38 days after Michaela vanished, the results came back. It was blood, and it matched Michaela. That result triggered the arrest. Investigators also pulled a Walmart receipt dated September 16th, the same day Frank reported her missing, showing a purchase of bleach, ammonia, and a mop. Surveillance footage tied to that receipt further built the theory that Frank had gone shopping for cleanup supplies almost immediately after killing his wife. Then there was the carpet. The carpet Michaela's body had been wrapped in wasn't random. Investigators traced it back to a neighbor who had given Frank and Michaela that exact carpet months earlier for their dogs. It tied the disposal of her body directly back to their shared property and their shared daily life. Detectives, led by Lieutenant Dakota Black, a trained tracker, reconstructed the movement of the body. Fresh tire tracks were found, leading right up to the small home where Michaela had been staying, consistent with a vehicle backing in to load something heavy. The theory: Frank drove her body to the edge of the ditch near Hamilton Road, pulled her out, let her fall 12 to 15 feet into the creek bed, then climbed down and dragged her into the drainage pipe himself. And then came the detail that finally demolished Frank's entire cover story. Investigators found Michaela's actual phone hidden in Frank's bedroom, the phone he'd claimed she'd taken with her the night she supposedly left with a stranger. According to Detective May, Michaela had owned 2 phones, a current iPhone and an older Moto G. And Frank had allegedly moved her SIM card into the old phone specifically, so he could log into her accounts and send messages pretending to be her, including the "I'm fine, back off" message he'd shown the deputy on day one. The mystery man in the white truck had never existed. The reassuring messages had never come from Michaela at all. Investigators also recovered home security footage from Frank's own phone, footage he apparently believed he'd deleted, showing Michaela entering the main house on September 15th and staying for those 14 minutes before her death. When Detective May eventually confronted Frank directly and asked why his missing wife's blood was on his work boots, Frank reportedly had no answer. On October 24th and 25th, 2023, more than a month after Michaela was reported missing, Frank Byers was arrested with help from the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office and the El Reno Police Department. He was charged with first-degree murder, unauthorized removal of a dead body, and desecration of a human corpse. In early November 2023, a judge denied him bond, and he remained in custody as the case moved toward trial. In April 2024, prosecutors moved toward seeking the death penalty. Frank's defense team had received more than 700 pages of discovery material by that point, but the case never reached a death penalty trial. On January 31st, 2025, Frank Byers pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. District Attorney Adam Panter said the outcome guaranteed Frank would never again be free. Sheriff Freeland Wood called it imperfect justice, but justice nonetheless. Michaela's mother, Barbara Harper, saw it differently. She publicly called the plea deal a cop-out, saying Frank got to avoid a trial and avoid execution, while Michaela never got any choice in what happened to her at all. Technical analysis. From an investigative standpoint, this case is a textbook example of how digital forensics and physical trace evidence can dismantle a fabricated alibi piece by piece. Frank's entire story depended on three pillars: an unidentified man, a working phone that Michaela had supposedly taken with her, and post-disappearance messages proving she was alive. Investigators systematically destroyed all three. The SIM card swap, moving Michaela's number into an old Moto G, was a technically clever move on paper, but it left a footprint. It meant her real iPhone should have gone missing along with her, and instead it turned up in Frank's own bedroom. That single contradiction collapsed the entire "she left voluntarily" narrative. Add to that the recovered security footage he believed was deleted, the DNA matched blood on his boots, the timed Walmart cleanup supply purchase, and the carpet traced to a specific neighbor and a specific transaction, and a clear evidentiary chain emerges: motive, opportunity, forensic trace, and post-crime behavior, all independently corroborating each other. Even the physical logistics, the fresh tire tracks leading to the small structure, the 12 to 15-foot drop into the creek bed, the drag into the pipe, gave investigators a physically reconstructible sequence of events rather than a theory resting on witness testimony alone. That matters in court because it meant the case wasn't built on Frank's word against anyone else's. It was built almost entirely on the small, boring details that criminals assume no one will bother to check. Psychological analysis. Behaviorally, Frank displays several patterns investigators often see in intimate partner homicide cases involving a controlling offender. He performed grief publicly, tearful interviews, claims of constant searching. While investigators noted he never once physically joined a search party, suggesting his distress was staged for an audience rather than genuine. His prior relationship pattern, described by former girlfriend Crystal Cantrell as manipulative and isolating, points toward a broader control dynamic rather than an isolated act of rage. She has said that Frank used emotional stories about his daughters to draw her in, and that the relationship later became isolating and frightening for her long before he ever met Michaela. And the timing is telling. The killing occurred within a narrow window after Michaela had, just 2 days earlier, recorded proof of her intent to leave and expose his infidelity, and it happened on the very day investigators believe she came back specifically to collect her things and go. For a controlling partner, a partner's documented, determined exit can function less as heartbreak and more as a loss of control, which, in the most extreme and tragic cases, some offenders respond to with violence rather than acceptance. The elaborate nature of the cover-up afterward, the fake suitor, the SIM swap, the staged texts, the cleanup shopping trip, also suggests someone capable of a level of calculated, methodical planning that doesn't fit the picture of a single blind moment of rage. It reads instead like someone executing a plan he had already rehearsed in his head. Michaela Faye Meave Byers spent her whole life stepping toward children who needed her. She built a family out of nothing but love and choice. She was working toward becoming the teacher she always wanted to be, and she had finally found the courage to walk away from a marriage that was hurting her. In the end, it was that same devotion to those 4 little girls that kept her close enough for danger to find her. Her family is still asking questions the courtroom never fully answered, and they're still trying to turn her memory into something that protects other women. If this case moved you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling us what stood out to you most.